Ethan Carter's farmhouse had always been his sanctuary, a humble, time-worn building at the heart of his sprawling farm in rural Greenfield. Passed down through generations, the farmhouse and surrounding fields were a living testament to hard work, family legacy, and the freedom of country life. Every sunrise, Ethan would step out onto the wraparound porch, breathe in the crisp country air, and admire the wide open spaces that had been cultivated with care by his forefathers. A former military man who traded uniform for overalls, Ethan now dedicated his days to tending his livestock, maintaining the land, and preserving the traditions that defined his family's legacy. Whether he was repairing the old barn roof, checking on his cattle, or harvesting vegetables from his garden, every task was imbued with pride and responsibility. For Ethan, his farmhouse wasn't just a place to live, it was the heart of his heritage and the embodiment of his personal freedom. But not everyone shared Ethan's reverence for tradition. Over the past few months, rumors had spread about an overzealous homeowners association, HOA, that sought to enforce a one-size-fits-all standard on every property in the community. At the center of this bureaucratic blitz was Kerren Miller, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Kerren's reputation for strict enforcement and petty fines was well known throughout the area. Always impeccably dressed in tailored skirts and high heels, and forever clutching her clipboard, Kerren took it upon herself to inspect every property for conformity, even if that meant trampling on the autonomy of hard-working individuals like Ethan. The conflict ignited on a particularly hot summer afternoon. As Ethan was heading back from checking on his cattle near the farmhouse, he noticed something odd. A gleaming car parked squarely in the driveway, blocking the only exit. His heart sank. This wasn't the first time Kerren had imposed her will on his property. It was happening again. When Ethan approached, he saw Kerren's smug face as she stood by the car with her usual air of entitlement. "Ethan," Kerren said in a clipped tone, "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. It appears that your driveway is now being used as a parking spot for community vehicles. That violates our guidelines for maintaining property aesthetics and accessibility." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Kerren, my driveway is for my use only. I have guests, deliveries, and everything related to running my farm. I don't need your HOA friends parking here, and I certainly don't appreciate your meddling." Kerren held up a freshly printed final warning notice, her tone icy. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. You must comply, or further action will be taken." Her words, though calm, carried the weight of an ultimatum. Neighbors who had been peeking through curtains or behind barn doors watched in silence as the confrontation unfolded. For Ethan, this was more than a mere inconvenience. It was an affront to his right to manage his own property, a violation of the freedom that had defined his family for generations. That evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills and the farmhouse lights flickered on, Ethan sat on his porch with a heavy heart and a burning resolve. The final warning notice lay on the table, a symbol of the HOA's growing intrusion into his personal affairs. He knew that Kerren's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of overreach designed to force everyone into a narrow mold. With a steely determination, Ethan vowed that he would defend his home and the legacy it represented, no matter what arbitrary rules were imposed. The stage was set for a battle between Ethan's deep-rooted values and Kerren's relentless pursuit of conformity. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle, Ethan resolved that his property, his way of life, and his freedom were worth fighting for, even if it meant taking drastic measures to protect what was rightfully his. The following morning, Ethan awoke to an unsettling surprise. Taped to the farmhouse door was an official envelope bearing the HOA's seal and a barrage of legal language. With a deep sense of foreboding, he tore it open to reveal a $750 fine for violating community parking and property accessibility regulations. The document was thick with legal jargon, its threats implicit and ominous, designed to intimidate and enforce compliance. Before Ethan could mull over the fine, he stepped outside and found Kerren waiting by the fence, her posture immaculate and her expression as smug as ever. "Good morning, Ethan. I trust you read the notice. Our community standards are clear. If you don't comply, additional penalties will follow," she declared in a tone that brooked no argument. Ethan's response was firm and measured. "Kerren, my driveway is for my use only. I manage my property the way my family has for generations. I'm not going to let your arbitrary rules force me to change that." His words carried the quiet authority of a man who defended his land through thick and thin. Unmoved by his defiance, Kerren replied coolly, "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. If you continue to ignore the guidelines, the HOA will have no choice but to escalate this matter." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan with a mix of indignation and resolve. Later that morning, while Ethan inspected his property to ensure no further violations had occurred, he noticed a nondescript van parked near the entrance. Two inspectors in official uniforms emerged, clipboards in hand, and began a meticulous survey of his property, measuring the width of the driveway, noting the placement of signage, and photographing every detail. Ethan's loyal dogs barked at the intruders as he watched, his heart pounding in protest. Determined not to be bullied into submission, Ethan quickly activated his security system. He snapped photos of the inspectors at work, recorded segments of their conversations, and meticulously logged the time and details of the intrusion. Every click of the camera shutter was a silent testament to his refusal to let his property be treated as a public parking lot for the HOA's whims. That afternoon, in the quiet solitude of his Barnes office, Ethan compiled all the evidence into a detailed dossier. He drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing long-established agricultural exemptions and property rights that protected him from arbitrary interference. His letter was both a legal challenge and a declaration of independence, a statement that his property, his livelihood, and his freedom were not negotiable. Word of the fine and the intrusive inspection quickly spread through Cedar Valley. At local feed stores and in whispered conversations at community gatherings, other property owners began sharing similar stories of HOA overreach. The growing discontent was palpable, and Ethan's case was becoming a rallying cry for those who believed in the sanctity of private property. As dusk fell and the first stars emerged, Kerren reappeared at Ethan's property. Under the glow of a single porch light, she delivered an ultimatum. "Ethan, you have 48 hours to bring your property into compliance, or further enforcement actions will be taken." Her voice was as cold as the fine print in the envelope, leaving no room for negotiation. Ethan's reply was unwavering. "I will maintain my property the way my family always has. My home is my own, and I won't let you dictate how I live." With that, he closed the door on another day of mounting tension, knowing that the battle for his property had only just begun. In the days that followed, the conflict at Ethan's farm escalated from a single fine to a full-scale campaign of harassment. What had begun as a routine violation was now morphing into a systematic abuse of power by Kerren and her loyal HOA enforcers. Neighbors whispered about how Kerren had a habit of parking her own vehicle, and that of her cronies, in front of properties that didn't conform to her narrow standards, and rumors even circulated that she had once parked inside a farmhouse driveway just to assert her authority. One overcast afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a section of his fence, his longtime friend and fellow property owner, Mark, pulled up beside him. "Ethan, you're not the only one suffering here," Mark confided in a low, urgent tone. "I've heard that Kerren's been parking her car on other people's driveways and even inside their properties to prove a point. Folks are fed up, and there's talk of her using those violations to fund her personal extravagances." Mark's words struck a chord with Ethan. The idea that Kerren could repeatedly invade his privacy by parking in his driveway, and worse, using it as a tool to intimidate him, was the final straw. Determined to expose the full extent of the HOA's corruption, Ethan began a covert investigation. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to examine HOA records, attended board meetings incognito, and even recorded murmurs of discontent among his neighbors. Every piece of evidence painted a damning picture. Kerren was not interested in maintaining community standards. She was exploiting her power to control property owners and enrich herself. Late one rainy night, as lightning flickered across the sky and thunder rumbled in the distance, Ethan pored over photocopies of financial ledgers, anonymous tips, and records of parking violations that had inexplicably targeted his property. He compiled a detailed dossier that documented irregularities in the HOA's enforcement practices, irregular fines, sudden inspections, and unauthorized parking incidents that had become all too common. With every new piece of evidence, his resolve strengthened. This was no isolated incident. It was a systematic effort to subjugate independent property owners under Kerren's tyrannical rule. Word of Ethan's investigation began to circulate quietly through Cedar Valley. At a secret meeting held in the back room of a local feed store, several frustrated property owners recounted their own experiences with arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. One elderly woman tearfully explained how a misplaced mailbox or an improperly parked car had resulted in steep penalties. The collective outcry was growing, and Ethan's dossier was quickly becoming a rallying point for those determined to fight back against the HOA's abuse of power. Realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, Ethan upgraded his security system. He installed additional cameras along the perimeter of his property and logged every instance of unauthorized parking, every unannounced inspection, and every moment of trespassing. His loyal dogs served as both guardians and a reminder that his property was not for public use. Every detail was captured, every moment recorded for the day when the truth would be laid bare. Under the oppressive weight of these threats, Kerren's tactics became even more aggressive. In a series of curt, official letters, she warned that any further noncompliance would result in severe penalties, including the possibility of legal action to seize portions of privately owned property. The community grew increasingly anxious, and it became clear that if this abuse continued, no one would be safe from her arbitrary interference. One stormy night, as rain hammered the roof and lightning illuminated the dark skies, Ethan sat in his barn office and reviewed his dossier one last time. The evidence was overwhelming, and he resolved that it was time to take his case public. With a steely determination burning in his eyes, he reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of the records, photographs, and videos that documented every instance of the HOA's overreach. Standing outside in the cool, rain-soaked darkness, Ethan vowed that he would no longer tolerate the violation of his rights. This was not just about a parking violation. It was about preserving the legacy of his home and the freedom to live without arbitrary interference. The tension reached a boiling point one sweltering morning, when Ethan arrived at his farmhouse only to witness an outrageous scene. As he approached the entrance to his beloved property, he discovered that Kerren had once again parked her car, this time right in front of his farmhouse. The vehicle blocked the only exit, trapping Ethan inside and disrupting the flow of daily life on his ranch. It was an act of blatant disrespect, a signal that Kerren was determined to assert her authority on his land regardless of his objections. Ethan's frustration boiled over. He knew that simply reporting the incident would not be enough. Instead, he decided to take matters into his own hands. With a measured calm, he devised a plan that was both clever and symbolic. He would block the exit of his farmhouse, ensuring that Kerren's car remained an immovable symbol of her intrusion. And then he'd leave for the weekend, sending a clear message that he was not going to engage with her petty power plays. After a quick breakfast and a moment to gather his thoughts, Ethan set his plan in motion. He retrieved an old tractor from the barn, maneuvered it to the front of the farmhouse, and parked it strategically so that the only exit was completely blocked. The sight was both defiant and ingenious, a practical solution that asserted his right to control access to his property. Once the tractor was firmly in place, Ethan made a final check around his farm. Satisfied that he had taken control of his space, he locked the farmhouse and left a note on the door, "Out for the weekend. My property, my rules." Later that day, Kerren and her entourage arrived to find Ethan's driveway effectively blocked. Their usual smirks were replaced by shocked expressions. Kerren attempted to call for assistance and demanded that the exit be cleared immediately, but her commands fell on deaf ears. Neighbors who had witnessed the scene began to murmur in approval, and the image of Kerren's stunned face as she stood before the blocked exit was captured by several onlookers on their phones. At the next HOA meeting, held in the local community center, Ethan made his presence known not by attending in person, but by presenting the evidence. He displayed photos and video footage of his strategically parked tractor, along with testimonials from neighbors who had seen the incident firsthand. "This is my way of saying that my property is not for you to commandeer," he stated calmly. "When you block my access, you force me to take control of my own destiny." The room fell silent as board members and homeowners absorbed Ethan's words. The evidence was undeniable. Kerren's continued intrusion had forced him to take dramatic measures. Some board members, once loyal to Kerren's strict enforcement, began to question the validity of her methods. The community sentiment was shifting, and Ethan's creative act of defiance had become a rallying cry for those tired of arbitrary rules. Kerren, red-faced and flustered, tried to insist that her actions were justified in the name of community order. But Ethan's calm, deliberate stance and the widespread support from the audience left her isolated. In that moment, Ethan had turned a personal inconvenience into a public statement, a declaration that he would no longer allow the HOA's overreach to dictate his life. As the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere was charged with determination. Neighbors expressed their solidarity with Ethan, sharing their own stories of harassment and arbitrary fines. The blocked exit was more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol of resistance, a testament to the fact that property owners would not be bullied into submission. That evening, as Ethan drove off on a short getaway for the weekend, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His ranch might be under siege by bureaucratic overreach, but he had taken a stand. Kerren's car, forever trapped behind the tractor, was a permanent reminder that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed. Desperate to reassert her dwindling authority, Kerren refused to let Ethan's defiance go unanswered. In a final desperate bid to reclaim control, she decided to escalate her tactics even further. Late one evening, as darkness fell over Cedar Valley, Kerren gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, armed with a clipboard and a phone, headed to Ethan's property with a plan to forcefully clear the blocked exit. Her strategy was simple: call the police and report that Ethan's farmhouse was being used in violation of community standards because the exit was obstructed by unauthorized vehicles. Kerren claimed that the blockage endangered the safety of the neighborhood by preventing emergency services from accessing the property. She was determined to portray Ethan as a non-compliant, reckless property owner who was endangering his neighbors. When the police arrived, they were met by a scene of organized defiance. Ethan's tractor was still parked squarely across the exit, and security cameras, already installed as part of Ethan's ongoing vigilance, were recording every moment. The officers found no evidence of a public hazard. Instead, they saw a property owner taking a stand for his rights. One officer, noticing the well-documented evidence on a tablet held by Ethan's representative, shook his head and remarked, "This is just a matter of property rights. Nothing to see here." Kerren's attempt to have the police enforce her arbitrary standards fell flat, and the officers left without taking any action against Ethan. Infuriated but undeterred, Kerren quickly escalated her tactics by hiring a private investigator to gather dirt on Ethan, anything that could be used to discredit him and justify further fines. However, Ethan's upgraded security system had already captured the investigator sneaking around the garage and creeping near the tractor. The footage, clear and incriminating, was added to Ethan's ever-growing dossier of evidence. At the next HOA meeting, held at the local community center, Ethan took the stage once again. With a calm yet authoritative demeanor, he presented the latest evidence to the assembled homeowners and board members. He played the security footage on a large screen, showing Kerren's desperate attempt to have the police intervene and the private investigators' covert misadventures. The room fell into shocked silence as the evidence laid bare Kerren's final, desperate move. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said, his voice resonant and unwavering, "this footage proves that Kerren is willing to go to any lengths, including resorting to illegal tactics, to enforce her so-called community standards. My property is not for you to commandeer, and I will not allow your arbitrary rules to dictate how I live." Kerren attempted to interject, claiming that her actions were in the interest of public safety, and that Ethan was simply uncooperative. But her words were drowned out by the mounting evidence and the resounding support from the community. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs of approval, and nods of solidarity filled the room. It was clear that Kerren's desperate tactics had not only failed to intimidate, but had instead further undermined her authority. By the close of the meeting, it was evident that Kerren's days of unchecked power were numbered. The legal and public backlash was building, and every piece of evidence Ethan presented chipped away at her credibility. Her final, desperate move had only solidified the community's resolve to reclaim their rights. That night, as Ethan sat on his porch reviewing the damning footage one last time, he felt a mixture of sadness for the losses his property had suffered and satisfaction at the progress made. He vowed to pursue every legal avenue to hold Kerren accountable for her repeated transgressions. Kerren's final gambit had failed spectacularly, and the evidence was now irrefutable, a catalyst that would lead to the eventual collapse of her tyrannical reign. In the wake of Kerren's exposed misdeeds and the resounding public outcry, the atmosphere in Cedar Valley transformed overnight. What had begun as isolated incidents of parking and trespassing had escalated into a full-scale revolt against an oppressive HOA. Neighbors, long frustrated by Kerren's arbitrary enforcement of rules, began to unite in a common cause, reclaiming their rights and their privacy. At a raucous community meeting held at the local civic center, long-suffering residents took turns recounting their personal experiences of harassment, unauthorized parking on their properties, intrusive inspections, and the humiliation of having their sanctuaries violated. The air was thick with determination and righteous anger as each testimony underscored the oppressive nature of Kerren's rule. Under this mounting pressure, the HOA board found itself in a precarious position. In a dramatic, historic vote broadcast live to the community, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's methods, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause, tears of relief, and a collective sense of liberation. For the first time in years, the residents of Cedar Valley felt empowered. Their voices had finally shattered the stranglehold of arbitrary authority. Simultaneously, local authorities launched an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors uncovered a labyrinth of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had been used to subjugate property owners for far too long. Headlines in local newspapers blared, "HOA tyranny toppled," and "community triumph over injustice," and the public celebrated the dawn of a new era. For Ethan, the removal of Kerren was a deeply personal victory. His courageous act of blocking the farmhouse exit and the subsequent evidence of repeated trespassing had sparked a movement that not only reclaimed his property, but also set a precedent for every homeowner in Cedar Valley. As he sat on his porch each evening, watching the sun cast long, golden shadows across his land, he felt a profound sense of vindication. His ranch, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud symbol of resilience and the power of unity. In the weeks that followed, a new democratically elected HOA was established under leaders who promised transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. The oppressive rules and invasive practices were dismantled, replaced by guidelines that celebrated local traditions and protected property rights. The community, once cowed by fear, now thrived on collaboration and mutual respect. As the last rays of sunset bathed Cedar Valley in warm hues, the legacy of Kerren's tyranny faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its dignity, and Ethan's determined stand had become a beacon of hope for all. With the community united and the damning evidence of Kerren's repeated violations in hand, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt structure of the old HOA. Bolstered by Ethan's comprehensive dossier featuring high-definition security footage, photographs of unauthorized parking and trespassing, and meticulous logs of every incident, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited property owners for years. A series of class action lawsuits was promptly filed on behalf of the affected residents. In a landmark courtroom session, A judge carefully reviewed the evidence and delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves throughout Cedar Valley. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their transgressions. The state attorney general even established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such abuses would never again take root. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines blared HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over injustice, while televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of residents who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. Ethan's determined stand, blocking the exit, gathering evidence, and refusing to be bullied, became a powerful symbol of resistance and accountability. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members faced intense scrutiny, and several were indicted on charges related to fraud and extortion. The dissolution of the old HOA marked the end of an era of fear and bureaucratic overreach, paving the way for a new chapter in community governance built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal proceedings against the corrupt HOA reached their conclusion, Kerren Miller's personal world began to crumble in a series of humiliating reversals. Once the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, Kerren was now exposed as a bully whose authority was built on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny mounted as evidence of her repeated trespassing and her persistent attempts to park on private property was paraded in courtrooms and splashed across local media. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once signified her power were seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a final dramatic vote, the HOA board forced her resignation amid a storm of public outrage. Gossip spread like wildfire through Cedar Valley. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation, and headlines chronicled her fall from grace. In a bitter twist of irony, Kerren was later forced to accept a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to the very rules she once flouted. One brisk morning, as Ethan drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That wry remark quickly became the talk of the town, a final, poetic mic drop on her once dominant reign. Interviews with former board members and previously intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's era of tyranny was over, and her personal collapse was a powerful symbol of accountability. Her downfall served as a stark reminder that unchecked power ultimately crumbles when held accountable by a united community. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's ruin was deeply vindicating. His ranch, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud monument to resilience and the triumph of justice over oppression. Every stolen egg and every instance of unauthorized parking had been recorded and used to dismantle her reign. Kerren's fall had become a symbol of the community's reclaimed rights and a testament to Ethan's unwavering determination. In the months following the dissolution of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's public downfall, Cedar Valley began to heal. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections faded, replaced by a renewed sense of unity, empowerment, and the celebration of individual rights. Ethan's ranch, secure and thriving under his careful stewardship, stood as a living testament to the resilience of those who refused to be bullied. At a festive community picnic held on a crisp autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to mark the beginning of a new era, one defined by fairness, transparency, and respect for private property. Laughter echoed across the fields as families shared hearty meals and children played freely among the barns. In a light-hearted moment, a local artist unveiled a satirical mural depicting a red-faced Kerren being chased by a parade of HOA enforcers, accompanied by the caption, "Trespassers will be reported." Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Ethan watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of stolen eggs and invasive parking had given way to hope and collective empowerment. when a longtime friend approached him with a mock HOA violation notice for excessive trespassing on private property. Ethan simply grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed Cedar Valley in golden hues, the legacy of Kerren's oppressive rule faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights, and Ethan's steadfast defense of his home had become a powerful reminder that true power lies not in enforcing conformity, but in standing up for one's property and heritage. Fade to black.